Good afternoon. Today is December 7th, 2024. For those who know about me or have visited my website or have watched other videos since this last February, immediately after the Chinese New Year, when I have decided to go into the part of it to showing or participating in oral education. And again, still in all the bits and pieces about my personal cross-cultural life, about my exposure to the five languages, from my birth in Shanghai, China, to have spent 10 years from 52 to 62 in Macau, baptized by the great Jesuit mission Matteo Ricci, and educated by the Salesians in both Macau and Brazil. I take pride of this part of the education, and where I have received my exposure of languages since my days speaking Shanghai, Cantonese, eventually Mandarin, and a couple other dialects. But to have initiated my exposure to the language, again, is a post-war China. Only recently I can look back and say, yes, we were refugees, even though we were not poor, we were not short of money. And my father had took off to Brazil in 1952 with his three best pals, investing in the mica mines in the region. And all this investment of the mining, I have only recently discovered, where I have, in the last 46 years, actually engaged of the business of gemstones and minerals. And yes, 90% of my business and production is coming out of Brazil. And part of it was also in the region of Uruguay, the town called Artigas, which is one of the best looking amethysts ever produced, or since the days when the European, the Germans, or the Russians quality of the Siberian amethyst. That is another part of the story. I am, with the exposure of the five languages, with the exposure of the cross-cultural living experience, and in the varied professions where I have put myself through college since 1967 here in the US, working as a waiter in the summer, and eventually that had progressed, had moved me up to the total knowledge of the restaurant, managing bars and managing food, purchasing. Eventually, I did, in between my bachelor's graduation in 72 and my master's in 74, the same year I got married. And in those 2 years, I never talk about this part of my career as a management involving with Playboy. Sounds like kind of fascinating to you folks. And then also with the Marriott Corporation in and out of Chicago. I take pride of those jobs, which I have never spoken much about, but where I have learned the economic efficiency by being a good manager, and also involved in the very first time in my life about business forensics, meaning discovery of the many shenanigans, illegal stealing from the company with food, liquor, which the number were quite substantial. And more so during the 1 year with the Marriott Corporation in Chicago, we have also combated the dishonesty of the working staff. A restaurant where we have over 250 employees, from 150 to 250 any given night. In 1974, the unit can gross $150,000. And by every waiter losing their check to write orders, they pay $50. Even at that high cost, we're losing about 500 to 1,000 tickets a year. Eventually, meaning a few waiters make enough money by parking the cash and paying the penalty of the $50, end up buying 2 to 3 restaurants. Again, because my Cantonese, my Chinese, and my Spanish, working with the other team and staff in the back kitchen. The Cantonese were chef, the wait staff were also Cantonese, and the Hispanics and the other ethnic minority from the Filipinos in the management area and the black folks in the kitchen. Overall, is a very diverse in the social economics strata as well as in some of the areas linguistics and culture. But anyway, there was another small page in what I'm doing in bits and pieces in this oral format, and what I'm feeling a great deal of optimism, also involving now the development into the AI, a new era of AIs involving coming from the time and period of IT, the information technology in the past 10 to 15 years. But this format, with the most very quickly, very accelerated quantum tabulation, we will see huge gains insofar as information and gathering information and formulating information. As like I am almost daily engaged in the use of Gemini from Google and also ChatGPT. But the one that I am in favor of is Claude, which is coming from Anthropic. It seems to me their value and their system of operation, and I have a lot of agreement. I'm basically talking with Claude. It become a writing assistant. Every time I terminate a one set of mind frame or framework, and there are suggestions to what about, what if. And so I'm very optimistic by the involvement with AI and the chat GPT and Gemini, and most importantly, Claude, had turned me into very much of a futurist, where I have envisioned the AI and IT can do a lot of good. As a matter of fact, I'm urging my colleagues, my friends, that we now can have an identity where we're coming from. I put the ITAI into one word called, in Portuguese, called Itai. I use it because Ita, in the language of Portuguese Guarani, the native language of Tupi Guarani, Ita is stones. In all my life, I have always been fascinated with stones, be that a huge boulder or druses from the many amethysts you call cathedral, from just a simple river pebble, and in the culture of the stones. And I want to honor the indigenous people from Brazil of this group called Tupi Guarani. And so I want to say I'm coming from this era of Itai, or IT plus AI. That's one of the personal identity many of us can share. And what is about to come, or for some is already here, is the spatial web. As of this morning, I've been sharing with my Claude communicator, and we have expanded the imagination, the thinking, okay? And we are already using the spatial web, or what I think of it as spatial web technologies, in the 3D, the three-dimensional application into future intelligence, artificial or real, because artificial intelligence merely enhanced the existing intelligence. But our personal intelligence have limits. And I like to use this metaphor as to why we are driving. No matter how good a driver you are, we always have the blind spots that you cannot see to your far right shoulder, be it the trunk or the frame of the car or the vehicle. And for over 20 years, I tried inventing or thinking about imagination. How do a light can go on by the mirror, by where you look at your visual before you turn to other lane? That is an indicator that a vehicle is on your blind spot. So in fact, I almost trademarked this name, just blind spot, BLINDSPOT. So what the AI system have aided me, and why I'm looking back into history, doing my personal forensics and to study the formation of the US CIA by the Dulles brothers, two brothers. Alan Dulles, who created the CIA, and his brother was in the State Department. But his brother was also the attorney for the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. And I just have always the question about how can these two on the board of a private foundation being paid and yet send troops to have created a false military coup in Guatemala because the Guatemalan banana workers demanded a raise. I think they were making about 50 cents US a day, and whatever meager increase they asked was not significant, not by our common sense, but obviously it was not to the repressive corporations to allow such raise. And in so doing, Alan Dulles, by his association with the CIA, managed to have overthrown the government called Arbenz, 1954. And by the way, everything we do in life, right or wrong, there's a peripheral ripple. And such ripple by this quote unquote unjust affair in Guatemala. And when the coup taken place in the city of Guatemala, guess who was in Guatemala City at that time? Fidel Castro. And who else was in Guatemala City? Che Guevara. And what happened since 54? That have given their ideas, their ideology or their ideation about in Latin America, country, nations cannot be falling like dominoes by the power of the American Monroe Doctrine. So, minor things, but looking back, surveying such military coup, how did it happen? Why did it happen? So the AI search have already given me some very positive results. And I post this on my Facebook area of conscientization. Again, conscientization started by Paulo Freire of Brazil. Many have associating Paulo Freire as a leftist, as a communist, because at the time and era, I was in Brazil as a teenager, 1964. He was associated with the liberation of theologians. But I have taken another development where I have, by my exposure, Paulo Freire was the first ever Westerners putting Brazil Portuguese language into the Western cultural sphere. And the word conscientization, without full grasp of the Paulo Freire's use of the Greek word praxis, until I read up conscience and the conscience development in China. And by pure accident, in my study of Chinese, in psychology, in Mandarin, we call it 心理学, basically administrating the heart. So already psychology, by the Chinese translation, is far more about the conscience relating to the human heart where the West, the psychica or the psyche, was a nymph. If you look back into the paraphrase of the Western psychology, is a nymph, a Greek mythology, young maiden sitting by the side of a pond, looking down. Now, this looking down is a body language, which also involving about thinking. Reflective thinking is like I have just done my job reflecting, analyzing the past history of Guatemala. And also introspection. Introspection is when we think, we examine our lives, and that relating to the conscience of Chinese, instead of the psyche, they talk about the heart. And so from Paulo Freire, taking me back a little further to the 14th century, of the Xingshi by Wang Yangming, and also by pure accident, by sheer coincidence, my father and my last name, Yi family, have our origin from the little village used to call Yuyao in the province of Zhejiang. Today, Yuyao is a suburb of the major port city since history called Ningbo. So I am very flattered, honored to make my association of my cultural heritage with Wang Yangming, and by me, his teaching of Xingshi, the learning of the heart. I have my audacity to shape this term into the Western language, calling it conscientology, the study of conscience, the study of the human heart. But more and more, by me doing these placements, to place conscience, the language of the heart, and by way of Brazil, where today more and more Brazilian scholars, teachers, start using another term, which is a symbiosis, be that the thinking West of cognition or the thinking of the Chinese in emotion. And the synthesis or the confluence is called the affective domain. So, in bits and pieces, we are all coming together in seeing the part of China, Asia, Eastern thoughts, and the West. And I have this passage from Paulo Freire, and also from now the other Brazilian scholars, you know, advocating the affective domain. And what's also very interesting, in 1974, when I have created, during my master's degree and the college teaching for 2 years, I have developed already a counseling system, which I call 3C. Instead of a psychological analysis, I turned it into the all communication dynamics. I actually influenced by the teaching of transactional analysis by Eric Burns. With this transformation, I have turned the fixated state from the Freudian superego, ego, and ID to the transactional analysis of the parent, adult, and child, and all represented by three sets of spheres, and showing the transactions between the adult, the child, and the parents. But I have changing a little bit the dimensionality, where round is round when we are in agreement, and square is when we start a little bit of a thinking, pausing. That's not negative but positive. Just when you question, like you may raise the question, what is Paul talking about? The square is could be skepticism or even to dislike, but that actually trigger a thinking mechanism that what is he talking about? But in the way I used the round is so we agree. Square, you can be square and round, square, eventually square and triangle, not exactly complementary, but the square is that we pause of what the sentence before or the concept before is in agreeable form. But when the square turns into a triangle, that is the time of trouble, confrontation, disagreement, argument. But as always, I think we have this round and square and triangle, but we can always get back to the first base, the round to round, that in a more of a complementary, agreeable form. In this development of the communication dynamics, and I also developed the ambience, the cultural sphere, which is the university, and then the communication analytica, where I take my students to use the concept, what I just mentioned about the round and the square and the triangle, and do the analysis of their communications and communication with the party. They can agree, disagree, or the boss, or their teacher, professor, home, and parents. So I actually developed this counseling method out of a necessity because at that time and moment when I'm getting my degree, finished my master's degree, being employed by the university, with the starting the incoming engagement in the multicultural background of the era in the US, when more minority students coming in, when special groups, women students coming in, and also the starting of the gender of students who took on their own separate cultural body and demanding extra service with better understanding of their background. So that is the time of the multicultural education coming in. And because of my multiple languages and multiple cultural living experience, I developed my own cross cultural psychology. And subsequently, in the field of counseling psychology, in the area of counseling and guidance under the umbrella, the cultural sphere of educational psychology, I created called the 3C communication counseling system. I'm repeating. The first C is communication dynamics. The second C is the communication analytica. And in the middle is the cultural sphere, which is the university, the college campus. And of course, we have those subgroups. And that is how today, in view of the sets of circumstances, um, many of us have experienced the various accidents, atrocities since the time of the high school in Columbine in Colorado, to the Sandy Hooks in the East Coast, and then Uvalde in Texas, not to mention the gunman who took down 68 plus people in Las Vegas. This kind of a social criminal events have impacted the community of counseling and also in the outer framework, education and psychology in general. So let me provide a little bit of the sequencing in how I think that counseling system or the education of psychology will need to become more popular and maybe going into the course and the teaching of psychology awareness can go into not only colleges and high schools, maybe into junior high and even to the primary school. If our teachers and counselors and educators develop a much broad-based awareness of the communication in my field, psychology, counseling psychology, communicative psychology will come in very handy. Another part of my thinking is both the cultural anthropologist, psycholinguistic psychology, and in counseling psychology. I think that we are all seeing our society evolving away from the traditional of the Western religious cultural sphere. By me describing this Western cultural spheres will lead to the other subject matter I'm going to talk about, how the miscommunication, how the cultural gap between China specifically and the culture in the entire West. First of all, let's talk about the three major branches in the Western religion and religious culture. All came from the Abrahamic cultural sphere. First, we have Judaism. Second, we have the Roman Catholicism. And third, we have the Islamism, in the way the West scholars in most time and period structure those words in their phraseology, isms. And later on, we know about Protestantism, another branch, the offshoot coming from Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and the Luther's change in the time and period. And so this particular time and moment why I'm advocating psychology, the understanding people, psychology as a communication tools, is because in the old days, coming from my Roman Catholic background, the priest, the clergy, we call cura or curia, but in more specific in Spanish and Portuguese, cura also means cure, healer. And in the other time, in period of the parishes, is providing not the spiritual guidance, but also assuming the overall teaching, education by the Roman Catholic clergy, by the church, until the split with the Protestants, where by our perception in North America to see all the many colleges. I live in Wisconsin. We are Marquette University in Milwaukee. And just about 100 miles away, there's already another university from the background Lutheran or any other Protestant denominations. But still, for the large part in the Western culture, the Western educational system, and still were built by the Roman Catholics and the Protestants, plus the others. So I'm going back now to this major issue. There is a huge cultural misunderstanding, and also with a more impactful of this misunderstanding in the naming and labeling of the Chinese system of values of the three: Confucius, the teaching of Confucius, the teaching of Lao Tzu. I call Lao Tzu very much a ecological master. His emphasis is more about man and nature for those who play Tai Chi, who play Kung Fu, who play martial arts. And you look at the flag of South Korea, is the two forces, Tai Chi and then the other diagrams. And also the teaching of Buddha by way of India is very compassionate from the Buddhistic point of view. And these three groups all happening in the time period of the 4th century BC or near 500. And none of the three systems were ever religious. Here's the point. Even with the good academicians, such as the Jesuits, like Matteo Ricci from Italy, who was one of the major influential men in China, who also had his audacity when he first got into China. He made that point. He said, these people in the Chinese community need not to be evangelized. Now, this created a huge stir by his contemporary and other two missions, the Roman Catholic Order of the Dominicans and also by the Franciscans. I'm not sure the time frame, but some had even commented that close to the time that Matteo Ricci can face the Inquisition, the tribunal of Inquisition. And we all know about the horrid events of the Spanish Inquisition under the Dominican order, the man by the name of Tomás de Torquemada. But because of the language, because the ignorance of the Western culture and their domain, they have no other words to describe the teaching of Confucius, Lao Tzu, Tao, and Buddha, and they put the ISM right behind them. In other words, they are projecting, going back a little bit, the Freudian of the 17th century, projecting their system of learning and the system of education came by way of the three branches of the Judaism, Catholicism, Islamism, and Protestantism. Such misgiving had labeled the Chinese to become religious-like. And that's a huge, huge error. Again, I'm not here to demonize this particular cross-cultural mistake. Just based on my travel and my experience, I think this particular cultural dissonance and the cultural misgiving between the two parts of the world with the population 1.4 the Chinese, another 1.5 billion of the English speaking, are using that as two compatible nationalities, cultural mix. And yet we are still, I live in North America. When you're talking about legislatively, our Congress just assigned 1.6 billion to find ways to smear and to demonize China. I take it a little bit more personal, where we have to spend money to demonize. We have to weaponize our dollars in previous years economically. We are doing all this totally against the fair warning by none other by Dwight Eisenhower, speaking of be mindful of the military-industrial complex. Now that we are $38 trillion in debt, where I have witnessed in my business called China West, in my 47 years, the same lifetime of the time when Deng Xiaoping given his speech in Shenzhen and took China to becoming engaged, involving in the global economics. As I have seen the rise of the Chinese economy and the rise of the Chinese now cultural renaissance in China, it make me sad by the action by my government and country I live in to try to demonize and to weaponize our dollar when we have abused the long time privilege when we turned the petrodollar from the Saudis by giving them our technology and in the use of the dollar as the global currency. And in the meantime, we have neglected the old gold-based dollar in the 70s. I have my business, 1977, when I was making jewelry in the use of gold at $48 an ounce. Today, it's at $2,700. I know the mining operation in Brazil. I have direct access to the entire mining region of the Amazons. So in this, my following of not just business, but the economics, and to see the currency and see the status of the US debt, but now to use war as one of the few economics and the fair warning of the war industry by Dwight Eisenhower. It makes me very uncomfortable. Because I think this cultural dissonance by the ongoing demonization of other nations, so we could have waged war in the case of Vietnam to Iraq, the flimsy causes of the tiny boat in Vietnam and the white powder raised by Colin Powell. And in this time of Vietnam to the Gulf War, to the rest of the war into Libya, Iraq, Syria, what direction are we going? This huge mistake and historical error by the West judging the Chinese to have allowed a country continue to spend when our cost efficiency by us going into a service industry, abandoning of the production or to avoid the rise of the unions, whatever factor coming in, is not putting the Americans in a comfortable position. And I think if I can find ways to convey this message, the long and historical mistakes since 1492, the West have continued, intrude, invade, dominate, territorial gain, land, conquest, be that the Russian in the north to Siberia, be that the Spanish had controlled 2 oceans with the North America, half of North America land, and then the Pacific Ocean with the Philippines that was dominated, discovered by Magellan, or in Portuguese, Fernão Magalhães. All the ocean explorers, all the discoverers, be the Vasco da Gama in India, Pedro Álvares Cabral into Brazil, Columbus, they were all Portuguese. And every wave of the rise of the power by the colonialism, by the mass murder, like the Flemish king committed in Africa, the slaves captured by the Portuguese, and the export of the slavery into the Caribbean, and predominantly into Brazil, into the sugar fields, tobacco fields, and all the cultivation in North America. And then the colonization of India in 1700s by the rise of the English power and their discovery by the Industrial Revolution, the the gunboats, the hot arms, the fire, the muskets, the guns had outperformed of the cold arms of the Chinese. And because the overconsumption of tea had brought the British to force the sales of opium into the Chinese. So the past 200 years for the Chinese, we call it the century of humiliation. There was zero match between the power of the West and the naivete of the Chinese rulers by the end of the Qing era. And the weak China, there was not even a China. The real unified China happened only in 1948 and 49 when Mao had united the country. That is the first time we having a united China. But until then, you were totally fragmented, hurt and harmed and divided by the early republic, fragmented by the power of the warlords from all regions, not being able to unify. As a matter of fact, maybe part of the Japanese invasion was one of those minor effective way to have China united and then get subdivided by the parties of Chiang Kai-shek, nationalists, and the Communist Party by Mao Zedong. So the fragmented China in itself, where the Southerners helping the British, helping the Jewish family like the Sassoons and the Rothschild, eventually they become in-laws. The Sassoon were using all the ethnic Jews from Kaifeng, limited only to the ethnic Chinese Jews to develop their business in Shanghai, in Canton, Hong Kong, Macau, and forced in the use of the British East India Company have forced opening all the ports in China to have open trade. When opium was prohibited in India by the Sassoon's Growing Company and also prohibited in the US and in Europe. And when the British trying to force upon the Chinese for damage to create a second opium war, then come the Americans making their false demands, and so were the French. In fact, the French are trying to take Vietnam and enter China from that end of Southeast Asia to grab more land port, but were defeated by the Chinese. But all in all, what I'm sharing with you, history is a great deal of mishappening, misunderstanding, and China going through enormous humiliation. Even in name, Chinese were the victors, along with the allies of World War I. Even Chinese never sent troops. That China had sent labor to Europe, to UK, and to help for the war effort in World War I. But when the war is over, the allies end up awarding the German possessions of the province in Shandong in northeast China and the port of Qingdao, instead returning to the Chinese. The European group have decided to give Qingdao and Shandong to the Japanese. That's why the Chinese ambassador to the Versailles Treaty never signed a document, got up and left. A very proud Chinese diplomat. So for those who care to know about history, be mindful that who has set up the Japanese position in China to eventually take Manchuria have all been plot and planned and happened in that particular meeting of the Versailles Treaty. I'm highlighting some of this comment about the misgiving, and the collective ignorance by culture, by education, by not knowing the heart culture, conscience culture of the Chinese, to have created such a 525 years of a total misunderstanding that the Chinese mindset were never created by religion, never by the external force, but instead is the innermost moral and value compass reinforced by Confucius, by Buddha, by Tao, by Lao Tzu, and we can incorporate later on the prehistoric time of the use of the other scriptures. Yi Jing will come up most from the Taoist segment, but plus others. And also the rich Zen value from Buddha again. By me making this clarification, as in the format of narration presentation, everything I said today, in very short time, the entire narration can be printed, documented. It become a series of lessons where you can critique, comment, add, minus. The future learning by way of AI and in the development of my open books. No people can become ignorant because your ignorance can be immediately clarified on the one instant in the use of ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and the rest of the global AI instruments and tools that have yet to come. So whatever we do is the good and clear evidence, documentation. What the open books have created is become a blockchain used application. Screening what I say here can be immediately inserted by a commentator into my narrative form and presented his or her angle, or what had that stimulated another discussion. I think the future learning will be open up in the open books format because ignorance is the ultimate trouble to disrupt our human understanding. And I'll be looking forward to share with you in the next segment. I'll try to do 1 to 2 presentations daily, starting with English, Portuguese. I will put in Spanish, and in Chinese, I will do Cantonese. And I'm willing to show some of my linguistic weakness in Cantonese, even though I speak Cantonese, but have never spoken about psychology, about this era, this time and moment, about conscience in the Chinese language. In my youth, nor in the last 45 years, even though I'm engaged with China on a daily basis, but the subject matter, we have a little bit of a rough spots, but I think that all will come into clarity by the input of my audience, be that criticism, add-ons, because the open learning is the ultimate tool to give us potentially the world peace. In the meantime, we all know what the nuclear arsenal can do by the Russians, by the Americans, Chinese, Israel, France, India, and I hope the human will have found more wisdom than the weapon intelligence. Have a good evening.